What happens when a former president sits down for what's supposed to be a standard political interview, but instead turns into one of the most explosive confrontations ever broadcast on national television? What you're about to witness is a masterclass in tension, as two strong personalities clash in real time, with neither willing to back down. This isn't your typical softball interview. This is raw, unfiltered, and it escalates faster than anyone could have predicted. Before we get into exactly how this interview imploded, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me who you think handled this better. Now let's dive into what actually went down. The studio lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and Kristen Welker sat across from Donald Trump with her notes prepared and her questions ready. This was supposed to be an opportunity for the former president to discuss his policy positions, his vision for the country, and address some of the controversies that had been swirling around him. But from the very first question, it was clear this interview was going to be anything but routine. Welker started with what seemed like a straightforward question about the economy, asking Trump to explain his plans for addressing inflation and the rising cost of living that millions of Americans were experiencing. Trump leaned back in his chair, nodding as if he'd heard this question 1,000 times before, and launched into his response about how the economy was the best it had ever been under his administration, how unemployment was at record lows, and how everything had fallen apart since he left office. But Welker wasn't letting him off that easy. She interrupted him mid-sentence, something that immediately shifted the energy in the room. She pointed out that economists had noted that many of the economic trends he was taking credit for had actually started under the previous administration, and that some of the challenges facing the current economy were direct results of policies he had implemented. Trump's expression changed instantly. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, pointing his finger directly at Welker. He told her that this was exactly what he expected from the mainstream media, this constant need to rewrite history and refuse to give him credit for anything positive. He said that no president had ever been treated as unfairly as he had been, and that the media, including NBC, had been on a mission to destroy him from day one. Welker didn't flinch. She calmly responded that her job wasn't to give him credit or take it away, but to ask questions based on facts and data. And if he disagreed with the facts, he was welcome to provide evidence to the contrary. This back and forth continued for several minutes, with Trump becoming increasingly animated and Welker maintaining her composed demeanor. She pressed him on specific numbers, specific policies, and specific statements he had made in the past that seemed to contradict what he was saying now. Each time she challenged him, Trump pushed back harder, accusing her of being biased, of asking gotcha questions, and of being part of a corrupt media establishment that had never wanted him to succeed. Then Welker shifted gears. She brought up the topic that everyone knew was going to be the powder keg of this interview: the ongoing investigations and legal challenges that Trump was facing. She asked him directly about the allegations, about the documents, about the questions surrounding his business dealings, and his conduct both in and out of office. Trump's reaction was immediate and fierce. He called the entire thing a witch hunt, a politically motivated attack designed to prevent him from running for office again. And he accused Welker of being complicit in spreading what he called lies and propaganda. Welker remained steady, but her questions became sharper. She asked him why, if everything was a witch hunt, so many people close to him had been convicted or pleaded guilty. She asked him why, if he had nothing to hide, he had been so resistant to cooperating with investigators. She asked him to explain specific incidents, specific conversations, and specific documents that had been made public. Trump refused to engage with the specifics, instead repeatedly returning to his talking points about persecution, about the deep state, and about how he was the victim of the greatest political injustice in American history. The temperature in the room was rising. Trump was talking over Welker now, his voice getting louder, his gestures more emphatic. Welker was trying to steer the conversation back to her questions, but Trump wasn't having it. He told her that she was being disrespectful, that she was interrupting him, and that she clearly had an agenda. Welker shot back that he had been talking for several minutes without actually answering any of her questions, and that her job was to hold powerful people accountable, not to give them a platform to deliver campaign speeches. That's when things really started to unravel. Trump stood up slightly from his chair, his face flushed, and told Welker that he didn't have to sit there and be attacked by someone who clearly had no interest in having a fair conversation. Welker responded by saying that asking direct questions wasn't an attack, it was journalism, and if he found accountability uncomfortable, that said more about him than it did about her. The tension was palpable, and everyone watching could sense that this interview was on the verge of completely falling apart. Trump sat back down, but the damage was already done. The atmosphere had shifted from professional to personal, and both of them knew it. Welker took a breath and tried to reset, suggesting they move on to a different topic, but Trump wasn't ready to let go. He told her that before they moved on to anything else, he wanted to address what he called her bias, her unfair treatment, and her complete lack of objectivity. He said that this was exactly why Americans didn't trust the media anymore, because journalists like her had turned news into activism. Welker's response was measured but firm. She told him that she had interviewed hundreds of politicians from both parties, that she asked tough questions to everyone, and that if he was struggling with her questions, perhaps it was because he didn't have good answers. She reminded him that he had agreed to this interview, that he knew what kind of journalist she was, and that he was welcome to leave at any time if he felt he wasn't being treated fairly. Trump scoffed at that, saying he wasn't going anywhere, that he had never backed down from a fight in his life, and that he was going to make sure everyone watching understood exactly what kind of interview this really was. The next question Welker asked was about his supporters and some of the more extreme rhetoric that had been associated with his rallies and his social media posts. She asked him if he felt any responsibility for toning down language that some critics said was inflammatory or even dangerous. Trump's eyes narrowed. He told her that he had the most passionate, most patriotic supporters in the history of American politics, and that the only people who thought their passion was dangerous were the same people who wanted to silence them. He said that his supporters were standing up for their country, for their freedoms, and for their values, and that he was proud to stand with them. Welker pressed further. She brought up specific instances, specific phrases, specific moments where his words had been followed by threats or violence. She asked him if he ever worried that his words had consequences beyond just rallying his base. Trump exploded at this. He told her that she was trying to blame him for the actions of individuals he had never met, that she was trying to hold him responsible for things he had no control over, and that this was exactly the kind of disgusting smear tactic that the media used against him constantly. He said that if anyone should be held responsible for violence, it should be the media for constantly attacking him and making his supporters feel like they had no other choice but to fight back. Welker didn't back down. She told him that words mattered, especially when they came from someone with his platform and his influence, and that pretending otherwise was irresponsible. She asked him if he could, right now, unequivocally condemn any violence done in his name, and call on his supporters to express their views peacefully. Trump paused, and for a moment it seemed like he might actually give a straightforward answer. But instead he pivoted. He said that he had always called for law and order, that he had always said people should protest peacefully, but that he wasn't going to condemn his supporters for being passionate when the other side was doing far worse and getting away with it. Welker challenged that immediately. She asked him what he meant by the other side doing far worse, and whether he was suggesting that two wrongs made a right. Trump told her she knew exactly what he meant, that there had been riots, destruction, and violence from the left that the media had barely covered or had even justified. He said that when his supporters stood up for themselves, they were called extremists, but when the left burned down buildings, they were called activists. Welker countered by saying that she had covered violence and unrest across the political spectrum, and that she was asking him about his words and his influence, not about what other people had done. The conversation was spiraling now, with both of them talking over each other, neither willing to concede an inch. Trump accused Welker of playing games, of trying to trap him, and of being a mouthpiece for his political enemies. Welker accused Trump of deflecting, of refusing to take responsibility, and of turning every question into an attack on the media instead of actually answering what was being asked. The producers in the control room were watching nervously, knowing that this interview was going completely off the rails, but also knowing that this was the most riveting television they had broadcast in months. Welker decided to try one more time to get the interview back on track. She transitioned to questions about his future plans, about whether he intended to run for office again, and what his platform would be if he did. Trump seemed to relax slightly at this, seeing it as an opportunity to talk about himself in a more positive light. He talked about how much support he had, how many people were begging him to run again, and how he was seriously considering it because the country needed him now more than ever. He talked about his accomplishments, his vision, and his belief that he was the only person who could fix the problems facing America. But Welker wasn't going to let him just deliver a stump speech. She interrupted him again, asking him how he planned to win over voters who didn't support him last time, how he planned to unite a divided country, and whether he had any regrets about how his previous time in office had ended. Trump's mood darkened again instantly. He told her that he didn't need to win over people who were never going to support him anyway, that his base was strong enough to win, and that he had no regrets, because everything that happened was the result of a rigged system and a corrupt establishment trying to take him down. Welker asked him if he was saying he still believed the last election was stolen. Trump said absolutely, without hesitation, without doubt, and that anyone who looked at the evidence with an open mind would come to the same conclusion. Welker pointed out that dozens of courts, including judges he had appointed, had rejected those claims. Trump dismissed that immediately, saying that the courts were afraid, that they didn't want to get involved, and that the evidence was overwhelming to anyone willing to actually look at it. Welker asked him to provide that evidence, to share with the viewers exactly what proof he had. Trump told her that he had provided it over and over again, that it had been presented in hearings and in reports, and that the media simply refused to cover it honestly. Welker wasn't satisfied with that answer. She told him that she had covered those hearings, that she had read those reports, and that what he was calling evidence had been thoroughly debunked by election officials, cybersecurity experts, and independent auditors from both parties. She asked him why he continued to push claims that had been proven false, and whether he understood the damage that was doing to public trust in democracy itself. Trump leaned forward again, his voice rising, and told her that the only damage being done was by people like her who refused to acknowledge the truth, who covered up for a corrupt system, and who gaslit millions of Americans into believing their votes didn't matter. The exchange was getting heated now, with Trump's face reddening and his gestures becoming more aggressive. He pointed at Welker and told her that history would prove him right, that eventually the truth would come out, and that when it did, everyone who had denied it would be exposed as either corrupt or complicit. Welker responded calmly but firmly, telling him that she dealt in facts, not in speculation or conspiracy theories, and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, which he had failed to provide despite years of making these allegations. Trump shot back that the evidence was there for anyone with eyes to see, but that people like Welker were deliberately blind because admitting the truth would mean admitting that their entire worldview was built on lies. He said that the media had invested so much in tearing him down that they couldn't possibly acknowledge when they were wrong, because it would destroy their credibility completely. Welker asked him if he ever considered that maybe, just maybe, he was the one who was wrong, and that his refusal to accept reality was preventing him from moving forward and actually helping his supporters. That question seemed to touch a nerve. Trump's entire demeanor shifted. He told Welker that she had crossed a line, that she was now openly mocking him and his supporters, and that this interview had become exactly what he knew it would be from the beginning, a hit job designed to make him look bad. Welker tried to interject, to clarify that she wasn't mocking anyone, but simply asking if he had considered alternative perspectives. But Trump wasn't listening anymore. He was on a roll now, talking about how the entire mainstream media apparatus was designed to destroy anyone who challenged the establishment, how journalists had become political operatives, and how interviews like this one were perfect examples of why Americans had lost faith in the press. Welker let him finish his rant, then very deliberately asked him a simple question. She asked if he was suggesting that any journalist who asked him tough questions was automatically biased, and if so, how would he ever be held accountable for anything? Trump told her that there was a difference between tough questions and hostile questions, between journalism and activism, and that she had clearly crossed that line multiple times during this interview. He said that a fair interview would acknowledge his accomplishments, would give him credit where credit was due, and would treat him with the same respect that other politicians received. Welker's response was sharp. She told him that she had interviewed presidents, vice presidents, senators, and governors from both parties, and that she asked all of them difficult questions because that was her job. She said that respect didn't mean softballs, it meant honest engagement, and that if he wanted someone to simply agree with everything he said, he should do an interview with one of his own media outlets instead of sitting down with a real journalist. Trump's eyes flashed with anger. He told her that calling herself a real journalist was laughable, that real journalists were objective and fair, and that everything about this interview proved she was neither. The atmosphere in the studio was electric now. The crew members were exchanging glances, unsure of how much longer this could go on before someone walked out. Welker, to her credit, remained composed, but there was an edge to her voice now that hadn't been there at the beginning. She told Trump that she had tried to conduct a substantive interview, that she had asked him about policy, about his record, and about his plans, but that he had spent most of the time attacking her instead of answering questions. She said that if he wanted to continue, they could, but that he needed to actually engage with the questions instead of just deflecting to his grievances. Trump looked at her for a long moment, and for a second it seemed like he might actually comply. But then he shook his head and said that he wasn't going to sit there and be lectured by someone who had already decided what story she wanted to tell before he even walked in the door. He said that this entire interview had been a setup, that the questions were designed to make him look bad no matter how he answered them, and that he was done playing her game. Welker asked him what game that was, and Trump replied that it was the game where the media asked loaded questions, took his answers out of context, and then claimed they were just doing journalism. Welker had clearly had enough at this point. She told him that his accusations were baseless, that every question she had asked was legitimate and relevant, and that his inability to answer them without resorting to personal attacks said everything viewers needed to know. She said that she had given him a platform, that she had let him speak at length, and that if he didn't like being challenged, that was his problem, not hers. Trump stood up slightly again, this time more decisively, and told her that he didn't need a platform from her or from NBC, that he had his own platforms and his own audience, and that they were much bigger than anything she could offer him. The tension had reached a breaking point. Welker asked him if he was ending the interview, and Trump said that he was done being disrespected and treated like a criminal in what was supposed to be a fair conversation. He said that this interview was a perfect example of why he called the media the enemy of the people. Because they didn't want to inform the public, they wanted to destroy anyone who challenged their narrative. Welker responded that the only thing being destroyed was his credibility, because he couldn't handle basic questions without melting down and blaming everyone else for his own failures to provide clear, honest answers. That final exchange hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Trump was standing now, fully upright, his mic still attached but his body language screaming that he was done. Welker remained seated, looking up at him with an expression that was equal parts professional composure and genuine disbelief at what was unfolding. She made one last attempt to salvage what was left of the interview. She told him that walking out would only prove that he couldn't handle scrutiny, that it would confirm every criticism his opponents had about his temperament and his fitness for leadership. Trump pointed at her and said that the only thing it would prove was that he refused to be ambushed by a biased media personality pretending to conduct journalism. He said that millions of people watching would see exactly what happened here, that they would see how he was treated, and that they would understand why he had no choice but to end this farce. Welker asked him how he could call it a farce when he was the one who had refused to answer direct questions, who had turned every topic into an attack on the media, and who was now running away instead of defending his positions. Trump's voice got even louder. He told her he wasn't running from anything, that he had sat there and dealt with her hostility for long enough, and that there was a difference between defending his positions and being subjected to a prosecutorial interrogation disguised as an interview. He said that she had asked the same questions 5 different ways, trying to trap him, trying to get him to say something she could use against him, and that he saw right through it. Welker countered by saying that if his positions were defensible, he should be able to defend them no matter how many times or how many ways she asked about them, and that his real problem was that he didn't have good answers. The control room was in chaos at this point. Producers were shouting into headsets, debating whether to cut to commercial, whether to let this play out, whether to intervene somehow. But the cameras kept rolling, because everyone knew this was television gold, even if it was also a complete disaster. Trump reached for his microphone and started to unclip it. Welker told him that he was making a mistake, that leaving would only make him look weak, and that if he truly believed in his message, he should stay and make his case instead of storming off like a child who didn't get his way. That comparison clearly stung. Trump stopped unclipping his mic and turned to face her directly. He told her that calling him childish was rich, coming from someone who had spent the entire interview acting like a political hack instead of a neutral journalist. He said that she had an agenda from the moment he sat down, that she had no interest in hearing his perspective, and that the only weakness being displayed was her inability to conduct an interview without injecting her own biases into every single question. Welker maintained her composure and said that the viewers could judge for themselves who had been fair and who had been evasive, who had answered questions and who had dodged them, and who had maintained professionalism and who had resorted to personal attacks. Trump laughed at that, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the studio. He said that the viewers absolutely would judge, and that they would see exactly what he saw. A media establishment that was terrified of him, that couldn't defeat him at the ballot box, and that was now trying to destroy him through character assassination and biased coverage. He said that this interview would backfire spectacularly, that it would only energize his supporters and prove to them that everything he had been saying about media bias was absolutely true. Welker told him that if he was so confident in that, then he should stay and finish the interview instead of retreating and claiming victimhood. But Trump was done. He finished unclipping his microphone and placed it on the desk in front of him. He told Welker that he had given her more than enough time, more than enough answers, and more than enough patience, and that he wasn't going to stick around to be insulted any further. He said that NBC should be ashamed of how they conducted interviews, that they had lost all credibility, and that this was why legacy media was dying while alternative sources were thriving. Welker responded one final time, telling him that accountability wasn't the same as insult, that journalism wasn't the same as propaganda, and that his refusal to distinguish between the two was exactly why this interview had ended the way it did. Trump started walking toward the studio exit. Welker called after him, asking if he had any final statement he wanted to make to the viewers, any last word before he left. Trump turned back briefly and said that his final statement was that the American people deserved better than journalists like her, better than networks like NBC, and better than a media system that had completely abandoned any pretense of objectivity. He said that they would hear from him again, on his own terms, through his own channels, where he wouldn't have to deal with gotcha questions and hostile interrogations masquerading as interviews. And with that, he walked out. The cameras captured every step as he moved through the studio, past crew members who didn't know whether to look at him or look away, past producers who were frantically trying to figure out what to do next. Welker sat at the desk, visibly processing what had just happened. She looked directly into the camera and addressed the viewers. She said that as they had just witnessed, the interview had ended prematurely because the guest had chosen to leave rather than continue answering questions. She said that NBC had extended the invitation in good faith, had prepared substantive questions about important issues, and had expected a serious conversation about matters of national importance. She continued, saying that what viewers had seen was an example of what happens when a public figure is unwilling to be held accountable, unwilling to engage with challenging questions, and unwilling to defend their positions when pressed for details and evidence. She said that journalism required asking tough questions, that democracy required leaders who could answer those questions, and that what had just transpired was disappointing but also revealing. She thanked the viewers for watching and said that NBC would continue to pursue interviews with newsmakers from across the political spectrum, and would continue to ask the hard questions that needed to be asked. Regardless of how those newsmakers responded, the screen faded to black as the interview that was supposed to showcase a presidential contender instead became a viral moment of confrontation, walkout, and mutual accusations of bad faith. Social media exploded within minutes. Supporters of Trump claimed he had been ambushed and had rightfully stood up to media bias. Critics argued he had melted down under basic questioning and had exposed his inability to handle pressure. Media analysts debated whether Welker had been too aggressive or whether Trump had been too defensive. Political commentators argued about what this meant for his future prospects and for the state of political journalism in general. But regardless of which side anyone fell on, one thing was undeniable. This interview had become one of the most talked about, most controversial, and most analyzed political moments in recent memory. It was a perfect encapsulation of the deep divisions in American politics, the broken relationship between politicians and the press, and the impossibility of having substantive conversations when both sides view each other as fundamentally illegitimate. The interview that ended with a walkout had paradoxically succeeded in capturing everyone's attention, even if it had failed in every other measure of what a political interview was supposed to achieve. So there you have it. An interview that was supposed to be routine turned into an absolute firestorm that ended with the guest walking off set and both sides claiming victory. What do you think? Did Trump have a right to walk out, or should he have stayed and answered the questions? Was Welker too aggressive, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you want more breakdowns of moments like this, and let me know what political interview you want me to cover next.